Hey guys. Okay. This time we're going to be watching Germany could not win World War II by potential history. Now, I agree with this statement pretty much 100% already. There is so much that would have to be changed about German decisions in order for this to be even a possibility for them to win. There would have to be changes in other countries' politics in order for this to work. For one of the big ones is Germany had to divert resources to make sure Britain could not land on their own, right? So Germany had to make sure there was coastal guard on the Western Front the entire war because of Britain remaining in the war and not surrendering. And then, so there's far less men and resources being put onto the Eastern Front. And also, the whole situation of, German production capacity probably could not reach the numbers needed to efficiently and successfully fight and wage a war in Russia because of how big it is, So, yeah. Those are just two quick reasons as to why I think they definitely could not win. Let's see what potential history has to say.
There, I've finished fine-tuning my what-if machine. It can answer any what-if question accurate to within 1/10 of a plausibility unit. Who wants the machine to show them an alternate reality?
Oh, I want to know
if Germany wins if Hitler stops making decisions.
Oh, this is
Who
going to be
else has
crazy.
a question for the what-if machine? I have one.
Do they win if they mass-produce the mouse tank?
Make that machine show me what would happen
if they took Moscow.
That's so plausible, I can't believe it.
People love rooting for the underdog. These stories strike a chord with us at a very basic level, and you can tell this by how
Except I don't think you should be rooting for Germany to win World War II. If you do, you're messed up in the frickin' head.
popular these stories are in media. This also translates to real-world stories, although real life does not have a plot that always turns in the underdog's favor. So there's this kind of romanticism connected to fighting for a lost cause that a lot of people assign to a lot of real-world groups. One of these you see talked about a lot is the German army in World War II, that if only dumb Hitler hadn't been in charge, or if different choices were made, that the war would have turned out different. And a lot of these arguments seem to hold water on the surface, but upon reflection, mostly miss the point or do not make a significant enough change to sway anything. These are my favorite
That is an excellent, initial argument there. He's acknowledging that these points people have on their thoughts on how Germany could have won, and he's acknowledging them and that they do have some merit. But he's then also bringing up the point that, hey, there's an issue with these points. They don't address enough to sway the course of history, right? And that, right off the bat, that immediately tells me as someone, obviously, I don't know potential history's, backgrounds. I don't know if he's degreed or not, or if he's, what his background is, or if he's just someone that's very passionate about history and has just done a bunch of their research and stuff. Either way, it doesn't matter. You can still be credible even if you're not degreed. A degree doesn't mean everything, right? It's just degree just kind of helps you get a job in the field, right? But anyways, that to me immediately lets me know, hey, this guy knows what he's talking about. He knows how to form his arguments, all right? Right off the bat, you can already tell he knows his argument. He knows what he's arguing for.
And how they're wrong.
Just take Moscow. Yeah, that works so well for Napoleon, right?
I hear this one all the time, that if the Germans had just driven onto Moscow and taken it, the Russians would have capitulated. but it is rarely backed up with evidence as to why. Even in the memoirs of German generals after the war, they constantly mentioned that the drive to Moscow would have meant victory in the East. And I think the reason for this is that they model the Russian campaign after the French campaign. In the French campaign in 1940, the French surrender once Paris is cut off from its forces and looks like it's about to fall. Using this model, a lot of people think that the exact same would apply to Russia. The only problem with this is Russia is a whole different animal, both politically and geographically. Stalin was going to put every man, woman, and child in the Soviet...
I think also not just politically and geographically. I don't know if he's going to mention it, but I'm just going to say it. The French capital of Paris, that region also, like northern France, that kind of territory there, that's a very economical part of France, right? Southern France doesn't have really the industry. Southern France is more known for like the vineyards and stuff, right? That's more agricultural. But northern France is more of, I guess, in a sense, the industrial heartland. As are most countries, right? Most Western countries, their capitals, or they have certain urban centers in which those are the predominant factories. Like in the United States, when you think of the industry centers of the United States, you think of the East Coast, and then California. I wouldn't say not so much Texas. Texas is kind of unique, right? They have industry, but I wouldn't say they're necessarily known for industry. They're just kind of huge, right? So they can have a significant industry and not be known for it, right? Like the first thing I think of when I think of Texas, I don't think of industrial heartland. And then when you go into the Midwest, that's the agricultural center, with little spots of industry, of course, like you have Chicago and Detroit. But in World War II, at least, those were industrial heartlands. Detroit, not so much anymore. Chicago also has been on the decline, right? But then you look at Europe, in which countries are pretty much just the size of individual American states, right? France is smaller than Texas. So taking Paris is a huge blow because that is like the industrial epicenter. And the reason following the end of World War I, the Rhineland was occupied was because that was essentially the German economic epicenter. That was where Germany's economy, industrial economy, was mostly focused. Now obviously that would get spread out under Hitler, right? He would turn more of Germany into an industry. And then you have Britain, obviously, in which their cities are the industrial epicenters. But France really only hit Paris, okay? Russia is more modeled like how America is seen. Yeah, Moscow is pretty industrial, but you've also got Stalingrad, you've got Leningrad, you have Kiev, but obviously Kiev got taken. Much of Western Russia is industrialized and is also like their breadbasket. But they still have more to the east. They have a whole lot more to the east, right? So that's another one of the reasons.
Soviet Union between him and the advancing Germans. And this is exemplified by the way the Red Army fought the war, often trading casualties for time. So if Moscow was taken, sure, it's a political and also logistical defeat, given that the rail network was centered around it.
Yeah, essentially the most important thing, though, about the capture of Moscow is that rail network. But then again, the Russians can just destroy the rail networks that lead out of Moscow, as they probably would have done had the threat of Moscow being taken, or in the process of getting captured, they probably would have blown up those rails. And that would have forced the Germans to spend time on repairing it, and that is time being wasted and resources being allocated to not fighting.
But no way do I think Stalin is just going to shrug and say, well, we tried, after Moscow was taken. And with that, we would probably see the Soviet Union fighting to the bitter end, just like the Germans did in reality. This is also backed up by real-world history from Napoleon's Russia campaign in 1812, where he went on to take Moscow but still lost the war. Russia is such a large and vast country that they have the ability to trade casualties and land at a higher rate than any other country can. And therefore, the normal rules of war, such as taking the capital and ensuring victory, do not apply.
Are they not seeing this?
Another commonly heard point is that Hitler made terrible decisions and he should have just listened to his generals. Now, I'm not here to defend Adolf Hitler, he's a crazy genocidal maniac, let's not make two ways about it.
Yeah.
But this isn't always the case. For example, Hitler and the High Command were all in agreement on invading Russia. They all very much wanted to, in their eyes, destroy communism and save Germany.
Yes, it is very important to note that, but also, I think there were disagreements as to when the invasion should occur.
As Hitler laid out
Just
in
a
his
little
book.
addition.
But once this effort was undertaken, Hitler and his generals began to disagree at times on what moves needed to be made. And once the war is over, many generals in their memoirs begin to claim that Hitler made all the bad decisions, and that if he had just listened to them, the war would have been won.
It's almost as if they want to save face and not take blame for anything. Because they served a crazy genocidal maniac.
And one example of this I already hinted at in the former point. Hitler's generals were convinced that taking Moscow would end the war for many erroneous reasons I listed previously. For Hitler, Moscow was a general direction in which to head, but was not the final objective. For him, the resources in the Ukraine and the oil fields beyond were a much more important target. And given Germany's oil shortages, this is a good example of where Hitler was right and his generals were wrong. And actually, a lot of Hitler's so-called mistakes start to make a whole lot more sense once you put it into the context of Germany's fuel shortages.
Yes.
And if you want more information on this, Tick did an excellent video on Germany's oil problem that you should really check out. Another example of this sentiment being wrong is Operation Citadel in 1943. Hitler's generals convinced him that an attack on the Kursk Bulge would cripple the Red Army and renew Germany's initiative in the war. Hitler saw this plan as very flawed, though, famously saying, "Every time I think about Operation Citadel, my stomach turns over." And seeing how poorly this turned out for the Germans, his premonition was eerily correct. Now, if this was the caricature of Hitler always overriding his generals that is commonly seen, Citadel would have been called off before it was launched. Now, these are just two quick examples, and yes, there are times, especially later in the war, where Hitler overrules his generals with poor decisions. The Battle of the Bulge comes to mind. But early in the war, when these decisions really count, Hitler is many times making the right decisions when overruling his generals, or going along with them in agreement of a common goal. So, Hitler should have just listened to his generals and he would have won the war is a moot point. Because many times he did, and his generals were wrong, and many times he didn't, and he turned out to be right.
It's all Adolf Hitler, Adolf Hitler, Adolf Hitler.
Yes. And to elaborate a bit more, what we see towards the latter end of the war, him going into his craziness and not really relying on his generals and instead overruling them and making poor choices, as potential history has mentioned. But you can also point to that with the history. Hitler overruled his generals, and he would be right. And then when he listens to his generals and they are wrong and they lose a battle, what does that tell you in your mind? That tells you, hey, I'm the only smart one here, so maybe I should just stop listening to these guys and just, make all the decisions, right? And that feeds into egomania, and yeah, it builds like that, right? Oh, there's so many things wrong with just building more stuff. Do people not... Whenever people say, just build more stuff, I feel like they completely forget about the manpower needed to build said stuff, and the resources needed to also build said stuff. Germany was getting bombed, especially by 1943, by the United States and the British. They were getting bombed a lot. Their factories were getting targeted. They could not really build more stuff.
This is actually a point I used to subscribe to. A very honest critique of the German war economy is that it was not on the right footing. And people make this argument usually saying things like, Germany should have just made more Panzer IVs instead of pouring resources into the Tiger. Or, Germany should have built the Luftwaffe back up so they could regain air superiority. And I will give you that the German war economy in many places was an absolute nightmare.
Yeah.
John Parshall does an excellent lecture on tank production in World War II and really highlights how backwards the German production process was for...
I've actually watched that lecture. It's actually a really, really interesting lecture, and I definitely recommend watching it.
...for armored vehicle manufacturing, and mentions how that knowledge can be applied to other types of war manufacturing. And although once Speer takes over, production is streamlined to a degree, and munitions and weapons production goes up year by year, it's not near where it needs to be to fight this attritional war. So obviously, the solution is to just streamline production, sort of how you see in the American model, and this would have given Germany a better chance in the war. Although this is a good criticism, it misses the core issue. The biggest thing Germany was running low on from 1942 onward is, as I mentioned before, oil. And larger numbers of tanks and planes wouldn't be any good if there was no fuel to run them.
Exactly.
Also, Germany was having manpower shortages as early as 1942 or 43, and along with fuel to run these machines, you need people to crew them. These are just two issues that cannot be remedied by streamlining production. At a certain point, Germany is just going to be out of oil and out of men, and no amount of additional tanks or planes would operationally be possible.
What's the matter? Run out of gas?
Kinda embarrassing.
This is another point that deceptively seems to make a lot of sense, as Germany was crushed by a two-front war. It stands to reason that if Japan and Germany through their alliance had coordinated an attack on Russia, they would have won. And that may honestly be true. A big boost to the defense of Moscow came after Russian troops from Siberia were sent west after the Russo-Japanese Non-Aggression Pact. The only problem with this is that coordination did not and was never going to happen. Germany and Japan were allies by circumstance and shared no real common goals with each other.
Germany and Japan were simply allies because they had the same enemies. They did not want to work together. They did not really like each other. For instance, there were German advisors in China while Japan was invading China. Germany could not care about Japan. They did not care about Japan. Japan was simply just someone fighting the same enemies.
In fact, they're operating in opposition to each other at times. German training of Chinese troops in the 30s as they were fighting the Japanese is a direct example of this.
As I said,
in short, neither side was going to stick out its neck for the other. In fact, Russia as a common enemy was probably the only instance in which they would have, and even then they did not. The reason for Japan not wanting to do this is mostly colored by the Japanese experience against the Soviets at the Battle of Konkangal, please forgive my pronunciation, where the Red Army gave the Imperial Army a very bloody nose in an undeclared border conflict. This incident convinced the Japanese to not go through with any action that would provoke the Soviet Union, as they did not want war with them, since they were already fighting China and would soon be fighting the United States. This avoidance of provoking the Soviet Union went far enough that during the war in the Pacific between Japan and the United States, the Japanese refused to sink any U.S. merchant ships headed to the Soviet Union. So, the Japanese attacking the Soviet Union directly flies in the face of the intentions and characteristics of the Japanese High Command, to the point where it strays out of potential history
Kill yourself.
into the realm of fantasy.
You have screwed me again.
Japan.
Wunderwaffe. Oh boy.
This is my favorite one. If they had just made insert ridiculous design here, the war may have gone differently. And it's the idea that this thing, or this thing, or this thing would somehow have single-handedly lengthened the war. And there are a few fan favorites for pics of these. The one I see most often being the Mouse, the ridiculous 200-ton behemoth that in reality would have been awesome target practice for Allied fighter bombers, and something for Allied soldiers to gawk at once it had run out of fuel and had to be abandoned. Or German jet aircraft, that although cutting-edge and superior to what the Allies had, still couldn't have been applied in a large scale due to the aforementioned fuel and personnel problems. And the list for these things goes on and on. A personal pet peeve of mine in this category is the what-if question about the German atomic program, and the claim that if they had applied themselves, the Germans could have come up with an atomic weapon first. This notion, though, just like that of Japan invading Russia, very quickly falls into the category of fantasy, once looked at for three main reasons. One, many of Germany's top scientists were expelled in the 30s for being Jewish, automatically limiting German atomic capabilities. And actually many of these scientists went on to work in the American nuclear program. So to make this win scenario work, you automatically have to make the Nazis tolerant of Jews, which is not going to happen. Two, the German atomic program is all but cancelled by 1942. As Speer put it, we got the view that the development was very much at the beginning. The physicists themselves didn't want to put much into it. Which works into my third point, that Hitler saw atomic science as Jewish science, and pointed the focus of German development towards conventional weapons. So we're not even talking about an atomic race between the US and Germany, as it was barely being pursued by the Germans. And to give a what-if scenario about it would fly directly in the face of what Hitler stood for. And this gets into the bigger problem with this question. that even if Germany does produce these wonder weapons and extends the war, it's only going to extend it long enough to be the first country to get nuked, due to the Germany first policy of the Allies.
Yeah.
You making a
Jet plane,
or a remote control that can turn you into
super soldier,
or is it just another dumb
tank.
There's another dumb tank.
Now these are just a handful of points that people bring up when talking about how Germany could have won, but there are many more that I didn't go into that are equally baseless, such as the Germans should have and could have invaded England, even though the Kriegsmarine would not be able to support a large amphibious attack, and the much larger Royal Navy would have probably sunk the invading force before it even reached the shores. Or
Yes.
that Barbarossa should have taken place earlier, even though it wasn't really the winter or the rainy season that stopped the Germans.
Yes.
It was a lack of supplies that needed to be brought up.
Yes.
For more info on that, check out this lecture by David Stahill. You'll see people bringing up scenario after scenario that bends reality and character motivations very widely to craft a scenario that Germany could win. But here's my point. Germany would not have won World War II no matter what way you slice it. The fact of the matter is, this is a country that is too small and too short on resources to take on the three largest world powers at once, especially given the erroneous actions and motivations they have. Basically, the Germans dealt themselves a bad hand and played it poorly. And the only way that's going to change is if you bend time and space to their liking with the benefit of 20/20 hindsight. All things that are not going to happen in reality.
Yep. Let's hope those bits of songs you use don't get me copyrighted. There's a part 2? Well, crap. I guess I gotta watch that next at some point. But yeah, I agree with pretty much actually no, I agree entirely with every single point that he made. I just wanted to elaborate further onto the points that he was making. Thank you guys for watching. If you enjoyed, remember to hit that like button and subscribe for more. Leave a suggestion down below as to what you would like to see me react to next. As always, see you guys next time. Thank you.